Good news, everyone. Pernak here with another class of paper school. Alright, today's class is going to be on vellum. Now, there are two different types of vellum and two totally different terms technically when it comes to vellum. So first off, we're going to start looking at the types of vellum, the type of paper it is. Traditionally, vellum is a writing or a printing surface made from calf skin. Now, some people do call vellum also parchment paper. Parchment paper or parchment is similar to vellum. The only real difference is that vellum is higher end and is made from calf skins as opposed to various other animal skins that parchment could be made from sheep to lamb to goat, whatever else are out there. But calf skin is what vellum is made out of. And I was looking at my notes here and I was trying to remember what else I was going to say. If you do see a term parchment paper, I use parchment paper all the time, and it's baking parchment paper. It's called that because it's mostly got the texture of what parchment looks like or what vellum looks like. Same with any parchment papers you buy at an art store. It's got that little mottled look after it, and it's meant to be a high-end writing paper. And that's all it is. It's like a calligraphy paper. That's what they're using it for. But let's take a look more at traditional vellum. So vellum comes from the old French term vellum, which means calf skin. Now, a little interesting tidbit, because parchment or vellum is a very high-end paper within the community. It's like the highest end paper you can get because it's so expensive. But there is a paper from Arches or Arches, however you want to say it, called vellum, and it's a high-end writing, bookmake, and printing paper. And they call it that because its texture is very similar, and it's a cotton-based version of parchment or vellum. They just don't call it vellum, they call it vellum. It's just, that's what they're calling it. It's an old French term. It's not even like a new one that's been used anytime recently. So let's talk about the properties of vellum. So first off, it's slightly translucent. It's also really decently smooth. It also does have an A side and a B side, what we would call. A side is the smoother side, and that's normally the inside part of the skin, while the B side is the outside part, which, you know, is the outside of the animal. So you can actually see maybe hair follicles left, or where the hair pores were for the hair follicles, or any scarring or any other. That's where all the impurities tend to be, more the blemishes, not impurities. Let's say blemishes, that's a better word. It's also really durable and archival, which is one of the reasons, I mean, old books printed with it are still around, or even old books written with it. Of course, many of them aren't because they were improperly stored. It's also the other thing, is the archivalness of vellum. It's also very, very archival, as long as it's kept right. So if you keep it at 68 degrees, plus or minus 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, or 20 degrees Celsius, or plus or minus 1.5 degrees, with a relative humidity of 30%, and that relative humidity can fluctuate plus or minus 5 degrees, your vellum will remain archival. Once you go outside of that, that's where you start to have problems. The biggest problems are mostly humidity. So if your humidity drops below 11%, vellum becomes very brittle and breaks more easily. So it's drying out the skin, making it, you know, crumble. It's not good. And if you go too high with humidity, let's say over 40%, which is what they don't recommend you do, it starts to get what they call gelatinous, and it's basically like gelatin. It starts to break down. Too much water gets into the skin and starts to cause it to break down, almost like gelatin, really. And then it can also be more susceptible to fungus or mold at that point. All right, let's talk about how vellum is made. Let me take a look at my notes here. So typically, the animal is killed, it's skinned, and then that skin is then cleaned, and then it's washed with water and lime separately. They don't do these two things together. And then they soak the hide for several days in lime. And this lime both loosens up and softens the hair that's on the skin and removes a majority of the skin. And then once that's soaked for several days, they take it out and then they put it on a frame and they stretch it. And the way they do that is, if this were your vellum right here, they take a little pebble, I'm going to say my finger's a pebble, and they put it around there. And then they take a cord and they wrap it around here, around the pebble, and then they stretch that out to the frame. And they do this all around the whole thing. And the reason they do this is so that way you don't accidentally tear the skin. So you have this little ball that sits there with a cord wrapped around it, pulls it tight. And that's the way that works. At this point, though, the tanner, or whoever is making the parchment, then takes a special curved knife. I don't know the name of it. I just know it's a crescent-shaped knife. And then they remove all the extra impurities, flatten it out, make it a little better, and then they remove all the extra hairs and all that kind of stuff. And then it's just left out to dry. And then once it's dried, you can produce it into sheets of paper. And I believe, and they say it's depending on how it is, but typically you get anywhere from 3 to 5 sheets for one piece of parchment, as from one animal hide. That's what I should say. Now, most people are not going to come across vellum. It is very rare and very expensive to produce. And there's very few people, and it's because of a lack of demand. No one's using it. So there's only like one company that I could find in the UK that makes vellum and parchment and all those traditional things. And it's because there is very small demand. Now, what is it normally used for vellum? I mean, it's writing, bookmaking, all sorts of things, but mostly writing and bookmaking is really what it's used for. Or at least what it was used for. Nowadays, it's limited. It's very limited. So the British Parliament and the Republic of Ireland, their parliament, also create all their laws and print them on vellum. Because it's archival, that's what they do. It's one of the few countries, those are the 2 countries that still do that. So probably why there is a parchment maker in the UK. It's also other things that are very popular with parchment or vellum, typically. Jewish scrolls are still made, especially the Torah, are made from parchment. Or not so much parchment, but vellum, specifically vellum. That's what they want to do. You do see some luxury books made, and the skin on the banjo can still be used that way. And there's another instrument, I'm trying to see here what it is. Bodhram. It's almost like a drum. It's an Irish drum. It's almost like a tambourine, except you hit it with a little stick. Now, we talked about traditional vellum. Now we're going to go towards the other type of vellum. Now, you will see something called parchment paper or vellum paper. And there are 2 different types of actual papers. These are made of plasticized plant fibers. Now, the major difference is if you see something called parchment paper, and if it's not the baking parchment paper that I use, it's normally a high-end writing paper. It's got a little mottled effect that looks like animal skin. It looks like vellum. It looks like traditional parchment papers. But it's not made from traditional materials. It's just a plant-based material, and it's plasticized. The other one is what they call vellum papers, and those are, it's basically like tracing paper, and it's translucent, And most of the vellum papers that they make are actually thicker than your tracing paper, even though tracing paper is still technically a vellum. In fact, it's kind of a catch-all for all the translucent papers are going to also be called vellum. But most vellums, they're used a lot in architecture, anything where you're laying images on top of each other, where you have to trace, you have to see through. And that's what they're really used for a lot. Finally, we're getting to the last thing, because I said there were two types of papers and two terms. So one term is vellum as a paper, which is one definition of it. The second one is a surface texture for paper. Now, because traditional vellum is very smooth, it still has a slight tooth to it. It still has a slight texture to it. And that texture is called vellum, and it's applied to many other papers. It can also be called eggshell because it kind of has a texture of an eggshell. Now, there's a few papers that do use these textures. There's quite a few of them. You can find them. It's in the printing industry, uses a lot of it, but really where you're going to see it the most is like drawing papers, specifically, like I said, Arches of Elaine has that eggshell texture, which is why it's got a vellum surface. Another one that most people kind of get into is vellum surface on drawing papers, specifically Bristol papers, because you'll normally have like a plate or a smooth and you have a vellum finish. And that vellum finish it's got a, like I said, it's got a slight tooth, just a little bit of tooth to it, which is what makes it much better for graphite and colored pencil and any of those other charcoals and even pastels, which is why it's good for that. That tooth grabs onto those materials and holds it. It's not as good for ink. I mean, can you use ink on it? Yes. You will get a little texture effect in your inks. You won't get super smooth lines if that's what's important to you for that. But otherwise, just vellum is a texture for paper too. So like I said, it could be a paper itself or a texture, but it's all based on the actual paper itself. Well, everyone, that's class for today. I want to thank you for coming and watching, and also I hope you learned something. Remember, give me a thumbs up down below to help support me. You can also follow along and subscribe to my feed, which is great. I normally have my episodes come out on Sundays, which I figure is a good day to have them done. You can also follow me on my Instagram and my Tumblr and my Twitter. The links are all down below also. Until next time, everyone. See ya.